The dust motes danced in the slants of late afternoon sun, the only things in the house that seemed to have any energy left. It had been 3 months, but the silence still had a weight to it, a physical presence that filled the spaces where my mother's laughter used to be. I was 24, living back in my childhood home in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, a temporary arrangement that was starting to feel terrifyingly permanent. My father, Frank, a man who had always been a mountain of quiet strength, seemed to be shrinking, his broad shoulders perpetually slumped, his eyes fixed on some distant, painful point only he could see. I was in the kitchen, mechanically washing the same coffee mug for the 3rd time, when he walked in. The sound of his work boots on the linoleum was too loud in the hush. "Ethan," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He cleared his throat, a sound like stones tumbling. "We need to talk." My heart did a little stutter step. "We need to talk" from Frank wasn't about the weather or the lawn. It was serious. "Sure, Dad. What's up?" He didn't sit. He just stood by the old oak table, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans, his gaze drifting over to the refrigerator, still covered in my mother's meticulously arranged photos and grandkids' drawings. "It's about the house," he began, and my stomach clenched. "And about your mother's things." I leaned against the counter, bracing myself. I expected him to say he was selling, that the memories were too much. I was preparing my counter-argument, a speech about giving it time, about honoring Mom's memory by staying. "I've decided," he said finally, meeting my eyes. "I want to get rid of it all." I blinked. "Get rid of the house?" "No, not the house." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Everything else. All of it. Her clothes, her books, the knickknacks, the furniture in the living room, her everything. I want it gone. This weekend." The words didn't compute at first. They were so absolute, so final. It felt like he was proposing an erasure, a violent scrubbing away of the last 30 years. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You can't be serious. That's all we have left of her." A hard look came into his eyes, one I'd rarely seen. "No, Ethan. We have our memories. We have each other. What we have in this house is a museum of pain. Every time I look at her favorite chair, I see her sitting there, reading. Every time I open her closet, I smell her perfume. It's a ghost, son, and it's haunting me. I can't breathe." "So you just want to throw it all away?" Like it was nothing. I could hear the anger rising in my voice, hot and sharp. "It's not nothing," he snapped, his own temper flaring. "It's everything. And that's the problem. I need it gone. I need to be able to walk through my own home without feeling like I'm going to suffocate. I'm not asking for your permission, Ethan. I'm telling you. We're renting a dumpster on Saturday. We're starting with the bedroom." He turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, cold and furious. A dumpster. He was going to put my mother's life, her floral print dresses, the novels she loved, the tiny porcelain bird collection she'd curated since she was a teenager, into a metal box to be crushed and hauled away to a landfill. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like he was trying to forget her. The next 2 days were a cold war. We moved around each other in silence, the air thick with unsaid accusations and grief. I'd catch him staring at her picture on the mantel, his face a mask of such profound sorrow that my anger would momentarily waver, only to return twice as strong when I thought of his plan. How could he? How could he be so eager to dismantle the world she had built for us? Friday night, I couldn't sleep. Rage and grief were a toxic cocktail in my veins. I found myself standing in the doorway of my parents' bedroom. It was exactly as she'd left it. A book was on her nightstand, a bookmark nestled a third of the way in. A tube of her favorite lip balm sat next to a small, framed photo of my parents on their honeymoon. They were so young, so impossibly happy, squinting in the bright Florida sun. I opened her closet. The scent of Chanel No. 5 and lavender sachets washed over me, a smell so intrinsically her that it buckled my knees. I sank to the floor, burying my face in one of her cashmere sweaters. This couldn't be trash. It just couldn't. And that's when the idea began to form. It was crazy. It was probably a little disrespectful, but it was the only thing I could think of to stop him, to save these pieces of her from being treated like refuse. I wouldn't let him throw her away, but I also couldn't stop him. So, I would do the next best thing. I would give her away. I spent the rest of the night in a frantic, quiet whirlwind. I didn't sleep. I moved through the house with a thief's caution, my heart hammering against my ribs. I started in the living room, taking pictures of everything, not just quick snaps, but careful, composed photos. Her collection of ceramic songbirds on the windowsill, the well-worn, floral patterned armchair where she'd drink her tea and watch the birds in the garden, the Afghan she'd knitted, draped over the back of the sofa. I photographed her favorite coffee mug, the one that said world's okayest mum that I'd given her as a joke, which she'd used every single day. Then I moved to her bedroom. This felt like a greater violation, but I pushed through the guilt. I opened drawers and photographed stacks of her neatly folded blouses, her costume jewelry laid out in a velvet tray, the elegant handwriting in her daily planner. I took close-ups of the book on her nightstand, of the lip balm tube, of the honeymoon photo. I was creating a digital catalogue, a testament to a life lived with intention and love. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, hopeful light into the house, I sat at my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I created a post on a local community Facebook group, one my mother had actually been a part of, dedicated to our neighborhood. The title was simple, but from the heart, not a sale, but a gift. Pieces of a wonderful life. I began to write. I didn't use our real names, just a recently passed beloved wife and mother. I explained, as honestly as I could, what was happening. I didn't villainize my father. I wrote about his grief, his need for a fresh start, and my own desperate desire to see these items, still filled with her spirit, go to people who would appreciate them, who would give them a new life. I wrote about her love for gardening, for bad romance novels, for knitting, for humming along to old Motown records while she cooked. I painted a picture of her with my words. Then, I started uploading the photos. I made it clear, nothing was for sale. It was all free. But there was a catch. If you wanted something, you had to tell me why. You had to tell me a story. Maybe you'd always wanted to learn to knit and her needles and yarn would be your start. Maybe you'd lost your own mother and her favorite mug would bring you comfort. Maybe you were a young couple just starting out and her armchair would be the centerpiece of your first living room. I wanted her things to be more than objects. I wanted them to be vessels for new stories, new memories. I hit post just as my alarm clock was set to go off. I felt a wild, terrified exhilaration. I had no idea what would happen. Maybe no one would care. Maybe I'd just invited a horde of strangers to our doorstep. The first notification came within 10 minutes. A comment, then another. And then, my phone began to buzz incessantly. Not with comments, but with private messages. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. A woman named Sarah wrote a paragraph about how she'd just been diagnosed with breast cancer, the same disease that had taken my mother, and that seeing my post felt like a sign. She asked for the Afghan, saying she wanted to wrap herself in it during her chemo sessions, to feel the strength of another woman who had fought the same fight. A young man named David, a teacher, asked for her collection of classic novels. He said he wanted to use them to start a free little library for his students who couldn't afford books of their own. An elderly gentleman named Arthur, whose wife had recently passed, asked for her gardening tools. He said his wife had loved her roses, and he hadn't had the heart to touch the garden since she'd been gone, but maybe, with a new set of tools that had belonged to another loving soul, he could find the strength to tend to her roses again. I sat at my desk, tears streaming down my face, reading message after message. This wasn't a morbid curiosity. This was a wave of human connection, of shared stories of love and loss. My mother's life was rippling out into the world, touching people she had never met, bringing comfort, inspiration, and hope. I was no longer just saving her things, I was orchestrating a quiet, beautiful revolution of kindness in her name. Saturday morning arrived. The sun was obnoxiously bright. At 7 a.m., a loud, grinding roar announced the arrival of the dumpster, a huge, hungry-looking metal beast that was parked ominously in our driveway. My father emerged from his room, dressed in old work clothes, his jaw set. "All right," he said, his voice flat. "Let's get this over with." He marched towards their bedroom. I followed, my pulse thrumming in my ears. This was it. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "We'll start with the closet. Just grab armfuls and take them straight to the dumpster." "Dad, wait," I said, my voice trembling. He turned, his expression impatient. "Ethan, we're not doing this. We talked about it." "I know we did, but just look outside first." He frowned, confused by my non sequitur. "What?" "Just come to the front window." Muttering under his breath, he followed me to the living room. I pulled back the curtain. The driveway, the front lawn, and the sidewalk were filled with people. Not a chaotic mob, but a quiet, orderly queue of people, standing patiently, some holding flowers, some with tears in their eyes. They were of all ages, all walks of life. My father stared, utterly bewildered. "What in God's name? Who are these people? Is there a block party I forgot about?" "No, Dad," I said softly. "They are here for Mum." I opened the front door. The crowd turned to look at us. A gentle silence fell. A woman in her 50s, Sarah, stepped forward, the one who had asked for the Afghan. In her hands, she held a small, potted orchid. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice gentle. "My name is Sarah. Your son, he shared your wife's story. I'm so sorry for your loss." She held out the orchid. "I just wanted to thank you for the Afghan, and to tell you that her memory is already bringing comfort to someone who needs it." My father was frozen, his hand still on the doorknob. He looked from Sarah to me, his confusion deepening. Then David, the teacher, stepped up. "Mr. Wilson, your wife's books are going to help kids fall in love with reading. It's an incredible gift." One by one, they came forward, not to take, but to give thanks, to share their stories. Arthur, the old man, shook my father's hand with a firm, calloused grip and told him he'd planted a new rosebush in his wife's garden in my mother's honor. A young couple, their arms wrapped around each other, tearfully explained how they'd just moved to town after losing their own parents and how my mother's dining table would be the place they'd start their new family traditions. My father didn't speak. He just stood there, listening, as person after person painted a new portrait of his wife with their words, not as a ghost, but as a catalyst for good, a source of strength for strangers. The hard, pained mask on his face began to crack. His shoulders, which had been held so tight for so long, slowly began to relax. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine, and in them, I saw the storm of his grief finally beginning to break. You did this," he whispered. "I couldn't let her go to the dump, Dad," I said, my own tears finally falling. "But I understood you couldn't keep it. So I set her free." He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of these strangers who were now bound to us by the invisible threads of my mother's spirit. The dumpster sat in the driveway, useless, a monument to a plan born of despair. And then, something miraculous happened. My father, Frank Wilson, the stoic, grieving man who hadn't smiled in 3 months, let out a soft, choked sound. It was half a sob, half a laugh. He reached out and pulled me into a fierce, crushing hug. It was the first time he'd hugged me since the funeral. "You're just like her," he murmured into my shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "So stubborn, and so full of love." The rest of the day was nothing like what either of us had expected. The dumpster was never filled. Instead, our house became a place of pilgrimage and connection. People came, not to scavenge, but to receive a piece of a story. My father, instead of throwing things away, began handing them out himself. He'd hold up one of her scarves, and his voice would steady as he told the woman who wanted it, "She bought this on our trip to New York. It was so windy that day on the ferry to the Statue of Liberty." He was sharing her. He was remembering her aloud, and in the act of giving her things away, he was finally, truly, keeping her alive. By late afternoon, the house was emptier. The closets were bare,